Robert Louis Stevenson was a Scottish writer. You know, it's well known here. He was a pillar of Scottish literature. He wrote fiction, he wrote poetry, he wrote non-fiction, but more than that, he was an Imagineer. Whereas all his family might have been engineers, he was an Imagineer. He was the sick boy trapped in his bed that let his imagination fly the scope of the world.
Robert Louis Stevenson was a writer who was born in Edinburgh in 1850. He died in 1894. He's best known for writing Treasure Island, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Kidnapped, various other novels, short stories, essays, poetry. I suppose creating characters that have become part of a wider lexicon beyond just literature. We know what people mean when they say someone is a Jekyll and Hyde character, and we're familiar with characters like Long John Silver. We're aware of that without even knowing who created.
My mother, who was a mathematics teacher of mathematics, insisted that I, as a 10-year-old boy, should start reading book called Treasure Island, which I thoroughly enjoyed, and then asked for more. And she said, oh, well, Kidnapped is also written by Robert Louis Stevenson. I read that and devoured that as well. And then a third one called The Black Arrow. But I wasn't so impressed with The Black Arrow, and so put the books back on the shelves and more or less forgot all about Robert Louis Stevenson.
He was a sick kid, you know, he was sort of restrained to his bed a lot of the time. Probably the person he saw most in this world was Cummy, his nanny, who instilled, I guess, a discipline in him and a wonder in him, but also had this sort of strict religious view on the world, which he ended up warring against for a lot of his childhood, in the same way that he maybe warred against his parents.
Stevenson's childhood, he spent much of the time suffering from issues with his lungs. What could either be bronchitis or perhaps tuberculosis, it's not entirely clear, but he was certainly sick for quite often, quite a large part of his childhood, in a way that perhaps gave him the opportunity to read more and to think about writing at a young age. And certainly he looks back on his childhood fondly. His nurse, he was particularly close to, although her strict religious beliefs did engender in the young Stevenson, you know, specific nightmares about notions of hell and certain aspects of the kind of more Calvinistic ideas. But I think for the most part, he probably looks back on it as a fairly happy childhood.
Stevenson was a very sickly child, spent a lot of his days in bed. We associate his days with a book, a collection of poems, The Land of Counterpane, the counterpane being the quilt on top of the bed. He went to university to initially study engineering, but he didn't perform terribly well because he didn't attend half of his lectures. So he decided that he would switch from engineering, and his father recommended he switch to law. And he in fact spent a total of 7 years studying, supposedly studying, at university, where he became embroiled in many student pranks, including a famous incident when they locked themselves in the quadrangle of Edinburgh University and threw snowballs at the passing citizens of Edinburgh, including the police.
His family had this incredible legacy of designing some of Scotland's, nearly all of Scotland's, most life-saving lighthouses. But for Stevenson, he was more interested in what the lighthouse in the remote island was as a story, as a plot from that perspective. I guess he wanted to be anything almost but an engineer by the time he reached his adulthood. And the real fractious nature of his ideals as a writer and the family expectations of him to becoming an engineer in his youth exploded, I would say, when he came to Edinburgh University, when he met other like-minded humans who were reading poetry and prose, particularly Walt Whitman.
Stevenson was a bit of a wild boy. He was very critical of the Victorian times that he was living in. The Victorian age, they had very strict lifestyle, very hypocritical, which Stevenson saw through.
I'm really personal about the love story that Stevenson has with Fanny Osborne, who was his wife, but at one point his wife-to-be, the fixation of his imagination, because he met her in a place called Grèze in France. And Fanny was like 10 or 11 years older than them and had like an aging daughter. And I guess the expectation was that Stevenson would fall in love with the daughter, but there was something about Fanny that he called the bosom woman that just completely encapsulated him, sort of lit a fuse inside him. And he spent years chasing her because she was actually married at the time, fleeing a philandering husband.
She returned to her husband in California, and Stevenson, heartbroken, returned to Edinburgh, but then received a cable and he left Edinburgh, left home without telling anyone where he was off to, caught a ship off the Clyde, off Glasgow, and sailed to, first of all, New York, and then in a train across the North American continent, arrived in California, so they were happily reunited.
Liable to be beaten upon by all the winds that blow, to be drenched with rain, to be buried in cold sea fogs out of the east, and powdered with the snow as it comes flying southward from the Highland hills.
The city of Edinburgh inspired Stevenson in so many ways. I guess mainly from when he was a child. He was ill for quite a long period of his childhood, so he was looking out his window into Edinburgh. But Edinburgh wasn't just Edinburgh, it was this portal to the world. It was the inaccessible places that he wasn't able to travel physically, so fused his imagination to let him travel statically from his bed, morphing it into dreams and daydreams.
The presence of the old town and the new town sort of symbolised a split between the rich and the poor, and between decorum and ideas that Stevenson explored in his work that revealed that duality. So the fact that the city was geographically and I suppose economically divided was something that inspired Stevenson.
It became the city not only that he learned to write in and cut his teeth in, but that he abandoned God in and provoked all the values that his family had bequeathed upon him. He started his own clubs in Edinburgh, the Liberty, Justice and Reverence Club. It wasn't even a club, it was a league, which was, half a drinking shebeen, but it was also about forgetting everything your parents taught you and putting the worlds to rights. League of like-minded thinkers. He kept the company of sex workers and drunkards and lowlifes galore, and was definitely living, I guess, the bohemian life, and was becoming the righteous free thinker that we all love him from being. Hi.
Hello. And the true realism, always and everywhere, is that of the poets, to find out where joy resides, and to give it a voice far beyond singing. For to miss the joy is to miss all.
So we're surrounded here by rare and antiquarian books. So with a writer like Stevenson, who I guess was, especially later on in his career, a sort of celebrity in his own time. These must have been like huge print runs for the age of them. So are those Stevenson books still rare because so many of them must have existed to an extent?
That's a very good point. And Stevenson is a classic author of what we now think of as high spots. There are certain books of his that are very collectible, highly valuable, and other books much less so. And it often aligns with the earlier ones versus the later ones. Treasure Island was his first novel, and that's one of his most valuable. But his earlier poetry and travelogues are less valuable because they're less in demand, and then his later books are also less valuable, even the ones that are more popular. There's lots of material that someone interested in Stevenson can pick up, even in first edition, for a few tens of pounds, because so many copies were made, they're still around on the market. Treasure Island was Stevenson's first published novel, and was a roaring success once it appeared as a book. It was actually originally serialized in a magazine under a pseudonym of Captain George North, which pirate adventures were a bit less literary, and Stevenson may have wanted to distance himself from it a little bit. But once it appeared as a book, roaring bestseller. But that was at the beginning of Stevenson's writing career. By the end of his writing career, he was so famous and well known that every new book he produced was already coming out to match a set of his works. And so he had a kind of a uniform style.
I mean, this is all that you're able to get, but there must be so much with every writer that disappears, whether they get frustrated and throw it into a fire or toss it aside, and there must be all of these hidden elements of their books that never came to be. You get the finished product, but there must be so much romanticism about what we nearly got.
That's absolutely true. And Stevenson wrote a book that was the genesis of Jekyll and Hyde, a full manuscript, and ended up burning it. And then, possibly under the influence of some sort of stimulant, in a fever pitch, rewrote the entire story in a few days. And that became Jekyll and Hyde.
Yeah, that's a story I'd heard a lot about as well. I think he maybe got some particularly mordant critique back of Fanny on the first draft, and then the story was that he threw it in the fire so he didn't feel the temptation to revisit it and to edit it, but actually would start entirely from scratch and go through it all over again.
We have a museum here in Edinburgh called the Writers' Museum, which features 3 Scottish writers, Burns, Scott and Stevenson. And of course, for me, the best of these is Robert Louis Stevenson. Hi, Michael.
Mitchell, nice to see you.
Hi.
Master meets sensei in the ballroom of Stevenson. Now, I'm quite glad I've caught you looking at these boots, because there's one of my favourite items here in the Stevenson collection. But one thing that's really bugged me is I've never been allowed to try them on. I wonder if someone with special Stevenson privileges, you've been allowed to try the boots with.
But you're going to go for the boots without the cap. The 2 go together. You can see in these photographs there.
Yeah. Well, I'd take the full fandango, actually. I mean, that's one of the things about Stevenson that I like the most, is he was a proper sort of fashionista. I think he looked great, he moved great, he was a stylish man.
And of course, the velvet jacket, which he was known as he went around Edinburgh in his black velvet jacket.
I guess one of the questions, being surrounded by all of these Samoan artifacts and Stevenson stuff, I think about is, what do you think Stevenson would have been like today if he was still around? Maybe if he stumbled into this room and saw all of his stuff around him, would he think this is a good depiction of how he lived his life in Samoa?
Well, I wonder if he would approve of our collection. Same applied to having a monument. He said he didn't want, probably because he was brought up with the Scott Memorial, recently built in the centre of Princess Street. He probably thought, I don't want anything like that. Yeah, I don't know whether he would really approve of us collecting all these images. And
But Stevenson, when he was in Samoa as well, he got involved in the local politics, and they gave him a nickname, didn't he? Or not more than a nickname, it was a new name.
that's right, Tusitala.
Tusitala, which is teller of tales
Well,
or teller of stories.
the common interpretation is a teller of tales. But in fact, on the advice of the New Zealand poet laureate, he said it was the writer of tales.
He was doing a lot of these moves in terms of moving as far as Samoa and to these hot climates because of his health. You know, he had this real bronchial problem, and it improved quite a lot when he went over to these hotter climates. So he moved over there essentially for his health with Fanny, but it was also doubling down with this sense of adventure. He had this adventurer spirit, and by this point Stevenson had become a bit of a celebrity, so the myth of Stevenson was rising high. So the fact that the author of Treasure Island would move to a veritable treasure island halfway across the world just added sort of fuel to the fire of who Stevenson was.
Stevenson travelled extensively. He lived in various places in the South Seas and Samoa. He also spent time in America and in France and in Spain. But many of his books that were written in these places did have to do with Scotland. He would often go back to the sort of Jacobite time, the 1745 uprising. Weir of Hermiston was written, or incomplete, but it was written whilst he was living in Samoa, but it concerned Scotland. I think there's a balance between the material that he wrote whilst living abroad, in which sometimes it would deal with local mythology, local folk tales, but he was still writing about Scotland at the same time. So it was as though his imagination was both where he was, but also where he had come from at the same time.
Stevenson really pioneered the idea of travelogues, real travelogues. And Walter Simpson and Stevenson themselves went across to France with a canoe, and they decided to travel, started actually in Belgium, all the way to Paris. He wrote Adventure in Inland Voyage. He also later went on a journey in centre France, where he travelled from Le Puy-en-Velay all the way to St. Jean du Gard. He recounts that in travels with a donkey. The donkey was called Modestine. Some of us have in the past recreated this journey.
In each of us, two natures are at war, the good and the evil. All our lives the fight goes on between them, and one of them must conquer. But in our own hands lies the power to choose. What we want most to be, we are.
So Stevenson's father, Thomas, who was a church elder, was dismayed when Robert told him, I think in his early 20s, that he was no longer a believer. And that led to a big fallout. Stevenson, he talks at various points in later years about a respect for Christianity and for faith, and certainly there is the impression that much of his moral code is based on the Presbyterian upbringing that he had, but he was open about the fact that he was an atheist.
I kept always 2 books in my pocket, one to read, one to write in. As I walked, my mind was busy fitting what I saw with appropriate words. When I sat by the roadside, I would either read or a pencil and penny version book would be in my hand, to note the features of the scene or commemorate some halting stanzas. Thus I lived with words.
So my favourite fiction book is The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And it's because of the duplicity of it. I mean, it's his whole notion of fictionalising Edinburgh. You know, as these two sides of this character. It's the sort of good and the bad in us, the settled and the restless, that sort of fractured human being that each creature is. For me, the character of Jekyll and Hyde is the character of Edinburgh. Think about its sort of demure, socially stale at times Newtown compared to the sort of rowdy, grotty, grotesque, but brilliantly infatuating underbelly of the city. And of course, Edinburgh, like some cities, has a veritable underbelly. There's this whole district underneath the pavement that we walk on, which the poor used to live in, that were sort of blamed for the plague of this city. So in these two characters, he's also capturing the ghosts, the guilt, the haunting of that.
My personal Stevenson favourite is The Master of Ballantrae. It's arguably his darkest book. The character of James Dury is probably Stevenson's best and most complete depiction of a psychologically evil character, of manipulation, and he very much represents what was modern about Stevenson.
You don't know Robert Louis Stevenson until you read all his letters, full of interesting details of his life and his interaction with people. If you really want to know Stevenson and what made him tick as an individual, read his letters.
I would define his writing style as shrewd, playful, adventurous, adventure-driven, spirited, sometimes wry, sometimes a little bit cheeky, a little bit sexy, a little bit smutty, everything you're looking for, but it's story first and foremost.
He manages somehow to find the most appropriate term, and he doesn't use any kind of baroque or over-the-top language, but somehow still manages to convey meaning almost as perfectly as possible.
Reading should be absorbing and voluptuous. We should gloat over a book, be wrapped clean out of ourselves and rise from the perusal, our mind filled with the busiest kaleidoscopic dance of images.
Hi there, Colin.
Hi, Michael.
Look at this panoply of Stevensonian gold dust.
Indeed, it's a wonderful array of early Stevenson material.
Well, that's good, because I'm also going to hone straight in on this one, which I believe are the board doodles of Stevenson during a law lecture.
Almost that entire narrative is played out on this single page, which begins with Stevenson taking notes at the lecture. He manages, 3 or 4 lines before he starts to doodle. We don't know who he's doodling, whether this was his lecturers or his students, but thereafter he then decides to write some verse.
These are from him at 6, 7 years old?
6 years of age, yeah. Essentially told the story of the history of Moses to his mum, who transcribed it, which is, we have the manuscript in her hand here, and he won a competition. But the loveliest stuff is here, his own illustrations. So this is the Israelites going out of Egypt. Indeed.
And it's amazing, you've got some of the pictures there, and we can see the massive contrast between Stevenson as a lawyer, almost wearing shackles in terms of how he has to dress there, compared to Stevenson when he's travelling the world, allowed to roam free.
The manuscript collection here at the library, the main strength is in Stevenson's correspondence, and I think it's there that you see just how consistently brilliant he was. Even although we have hundreds and hundreds of letters, almost every one of them reads wonderfully.
I love the poems, I love the fiction, but for me, really, my favourite thing about Stevenson and reading Stevenson was his letters, was his archives, was his epistles. I feel like him as a human being came out the most, bounced off the pages from them, and I'm wondering if you have any of the Stevenson letters here.
Here we have, Michael, a letter to my dear Cunningham, and this was a friend of his, and he's writing in reply to Cunningham's letter about an article on Robert Burns that Stevenson had written.
Am I allowed to hold this?
Of course you are, of course. What's wonderful about that is, you know, when you think about Stevenson and his friendship, he's here saying you were right to criticise aspects of my article on Burns. Yeah, and he accepts that kind of advice because he respects Cunningham.
Oh, wow. This is the first time I've seen Robert Louis Stevenson's signature inked in front of me, underlined, dotted on a page.
There we go.
And I feel the weight of it.
Yes.
In a positive sense.
Yeah.
I feel grander for having held this. I'm absorbing something here.
Yes.
As a human being, I think he was witty, I think he was sharp, I think he was deeply generous, a caring creature. So I think he was sort of vivacious and big-spirited and just, you know, bubbling up with imagination at every stage. Everybody described how ensorceling, how magical it was to be in his presence. Stevenson is both the physical creature of Stevenson and that spirit that jumps, leaps, sort of spring shots out of him.
He was utterly dedicated. He worked incredibly hard at his fiction, and that was almost to the detriment of his health sometimes. He seemed to get on well with most people, but he would occasionally fall out with people. You know, if things reached a certain point, then he was capable of being direct in his opinions and standing up for what he thought he was right. He was definitely had a very defined moral code.
Faster than fairies, faster than witches, bridges and houses, hedges and ditches, and charging along like troops in a battle, all through the meadows the horses and cattle, all of the sights of the hill and the plain fly as thick as driving rain, and ever again, in the wink of an eye, painted stations whistle by.
Today, he's still hugely popular. All of his books are still in print. He's popular worldwide. And I think even those who haven't read Stevenson are aware of some of the characters, the themes. I think the themes that he explores are so universal that that's what keeps people interested in his books. Certainly, there are still young people reading Stevenson's work. He's now, over the last few decades, had a real sort of reconsideration in the academic world. After a period of being seen perhaps as just as a children's writer, he's now very much thought of as one of the most important modern and postmodern writers.
He appeals to so many people from different walks of life and from many parts of the world. I don't think there'll be any other, well, who knows, Scots writer that is known and loved so much across the world as Stevenson.
I think because he travelled the world so much, there is little manifestations of him bubbling away in France, in California, in Samoa. Plus these stories are revisited time and time again. Treasure Island, Kidnapped, Jekyll and Hyde, reinventions of them and reincarnations of them are popping up in screen and television all the time. So Stevenson will be, a seed in everybody's belly for as long as I'll be alive, that's for sure.
Under the wide and starry sky, dig the grave and let me lie. Glad did I live and gladly die. And I laid me down with a will. This be the verse you graved for me. Here he lies where he longed to be. Home is the sailor, home from the sea, and the hunter home from the hill.